Washington's the heavy favorite for a 4-star quarterback.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. He's site editor with Athon Sports' Inside the Huskies. I'm the site editor with Huskies Wire. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $250 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Lars got a really fun show coming at all the everydayers today. But just a quick reminder, before we get there, make sure you subscribe wherever you get this podcast, here on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, anywhere like that. If you are over there on any of those audio-only sites, leave us a 5-star review. That does help us out a lot here on YouTube. Make sure you click that little bell as well so you never miss when we post a new video. Any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section, and leave us a like as well. All that really does help us out a lot. And follow us on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, at Locked On Huskies. We're everywhere, pumping out a whole bunch of fun stuff from spring practice. We got so many notes from that, as well as Rashid Williams, that group of wide receivers. They had a really nice day. But Lars, we got to start on the recruiting front today, because there's been all this buzz about Brady Smigel, but Derek Zammit, 4-star quarterback from New Jersey, he got a couple of crystal balls to choose the Huskies on Tuesday.
So it's interesting because as we were getting ready to record this, I was thinking back. I was like, man, I tweeted out that, it would take a John Cena level heel turn for Brady to not end up at Washington at this point. And I don't want to say, oh, that I was just kidding about that or anything. But at the same point, I don't necessarily think it's a, heel turn, like, oh, Brady's no longer interested in Washington. I don't think it's that. I just think, like, kind of what I've been saying, where my opinion was that Brady Smigel would be already committed by the time he gets on campus for his official visit in June, which is why we kind of thought, like, at the beginning of April, like, this commitment might be coming. And he's still taking visits and still considering his options, and was in South Carolina recently. And, he's got a couple of other visits scheduled. And so you just kind of wonder, if you're Washington, it's like, well, if Derek Zammit is, ready to make a decision, and Brady's like, well, hey, maybe I want to make my decision in July. It's kind of like, if you're the coaching staff, and we'll talk about it here in a minute, like, Brady, again, is a great quarterback. So you're not saying, like, this is the Jake Browning, Brett Rippon discussion. This is whoever we want, one of you guys, one of the two. It's very clear. Washington is down to these two quarterbacks, Derek Zammit and Brady Smigel. Whichever one of you guys commits first is the quarterback we're taking. So it just seems like if Derek is now realizing, like, Derek is Jake Browning in this equation, for those wondering. Brett Rippon is Brady Smigel. Both good quarterbacks, record-setting, good arm. And by the way, Brett Rippon in the NFL. So this isn't a lame duck experience here. You just look at two good quarterbacks and think, well, if you're Washington, you want to get this wrapped up, Derek might end up be the one committing first.
So let's dive into that a little bit, because, both have received crystal ball picks to choose Washington. And there's a lot that goes into both of these, where obviously Brady is the much higher ranked prospect, but you go and you watch Derek's film, and he is a really, really impressive prospect in his own right, where he throws really, really well on the move. I think that's the biggest difference between those two guys. Is Derek is a much better just passer on the move than Brady Smigel is at this point in his career. Now, that could certainly change, but he's just a little bit more mobile, a little bit more of just, I don't want to say the DeMond Williams, because that's a truly unique prospect, but just a little bit more of a playmaker. When you look at the 25 class and you look at Dash Byerly, you look at Keenan McMillan, and you say it's more in that light of just the Jedd style quarterback that we saw at Arizona as well, right? With Jane DeLora, with Noah Fafita, just in that mold of an improviser who's, just not that prototypical tall, big arm quarterback who can just launch every pass 60 yards downfield if he really wanted to. Where that's a really interesting part of this. And the fact that, as you said, where it feels like, hey, it sort of became a race to commit at the very end, where I want to take it back to when, Derek announced his top 4 in late March, whenever that was. And you and I sat here on air, off air, and said, oh yeah, this is really interesting, where, going into Jedd Fisch's home state of New Jersey to get a really talented quarterback. I remember watching the film then and saying, oh yeah, no, I'm really impressed with this guy. And you look at his top 4. It was Alabama, Mississippi State, Syracuse, and Washington. And this is a very interesting top 4. Then he goes down to Alabama, and, a couple things start coming out saying, hey, this staff really likes him. And Lars, you and I are very, very familiar, as are all the everydayers, with that Alabama staff of Kalen DeBoer, Ryan Grubb, Courtney Morgan, Jamarcus Shepard, Nick Sheridan, everybody else from UW that's on that staff. And there are some other things that go into this where this would be a pretty big win for this program.
Yeah, it was kind of funny thinking back on it when we were running through the teams. It was like, oh yeah, he's could be a head-to-head win against Alabama if you want to look at it that way in a sense. And it kind of, one thing you have to remember about this evaluation, where let's say he doesn't go to Alabama and maybe he doesn't go to Washington. Avery Johnson went to K-State. Like now, probably going to be one of the top quarterbacks in the sport, and this fall and cover maybe one more fall after that. So Kalen knows how to identify quarterbacks. Like so, absolutely. Whether he goes to Alabama or not, whether he goes to Washington or not, the clear common denominator is two coaches that know how to identify quarterbacks. And you kind of touched on it, where maybe he fits the system a little bit more. And I think that kind of is dead on, where that's the kind of dilemma, I guess, if you're Washington, where, man, you look at the high end upside with Brady, like you mentioned, and there's so much, the higher ranked prospect, I think, of the two in terms of just no matter which ranking you go off. I think Brady is higher.
Yeah.
And so, but again, rankings don't mean everything. We talked about this. We talked, spoiler alert for segment 3, where we talked about this in practice, where it's how many guys, you look back at X, Y, and Z class, and it's, every year there's always guys where it's not for the player's fault or the coach's fault. Sometimes it's just a mixture of both. And so you look and think, two coaches that know how to identify quarterback position. They have a type that they clearly want. And it's not a sense of I think the kind of unique tie is that it's from the state of New Jersey where Jedd's from, where you look and think traditionally it's like Washington be able to hold on to that. Like what if, Mississippi State or, Penn State starts pressing late in the season? It's,
So I think that's a really interesting discussion, where obviously New Jersey ends up being a unique case in that, right? Where it is Jedd's home state. And we've seen that now 2 years in a row, where he's made an effort to go into his home state and offer players and try to make a push. I can't remember the name of the 4-star tackle in the 25 class that he ended up making an offer and tried to push for there. But it was the same thing where, I remember, because that was early February when he went out there and offered a bunch of guys in that area and made some visits and did all that, because it was around the time he did his Good Morning Football interview. And he said it on the show, I'm out here recruiting because we want to make this a coast-to-coast program. And that's where this becomes really interesting for me, where something I wrote about over on Huskies Wire a little bit with Chase Calicut, the 4-star safety from Texas, who's got a top 3, unofficial top 3, we call them his favorites, of Texas, Michigan, and Washington, where getting a guy like that out of Texas is a really big win. But spanning across the country and going to New Jersey is something that in the Big Ten, these top flight programs are able to do. Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, whoever you want to do, whoever you want to talk about, they're able to come over to the West Coast and take players from the state of Washington, from California, from Arizona, right? And just as well, Oregon, USC, they're able to go out east. They go into Florida. They go into Georgia. They're able to get prospects over there. So this is something where if you're getting a 4-star quarterback from the state of New Jersey, that is something that in that regard and that acumen that you're looking for can certainly benefit you down the line.
Absolutely. And I don't think, because there's certain ones where we're basically saying, like, sometimes you take a guy and establish a route, but you're probably not going to get much out of him. Where I think it's almost in a way like Caleb Smith, where it's, hey, lay the foundation. Where is it, Caleb Smith being a D lineman, where Matt, like Matt already said, coming from an area that is traditionally good to produce those types of players. New Jersey, I think East Coast, that kind of New York area, pretty good for quarterbacks. And I think, obviously, I don't think, Jedd, kind of different realm in that, but coming from New Jersey, it's a very talent-rich state. I believe Jabril Peppers is also from New Jersey, and there's a handful of other guys. And so it's a talent-rich state. So when you get it from that perspective, I'm the only thing that just makes me hesitant is, again, when you go down, let's say October, November, December, before we lead into signing day, that's kind of the appeal of Brady, right? Where you have a West Coast quarterback, you have the guy from California, you keep the Cali wave, all those sorts of things. But so it's a unique dichotomy where you want to be a coast-to-coast school, but you need to kind of maybe try and, play the marionette a little bit in terms of where you find certain guys.
Lars, we're going to have so much more to get to on Derek Zammit, on a whole lot of recruiting stuff down the line a little bit, but we got to get into practice 7 because Rashid Williams, he really stood out on Tuesday. And we'll get to that right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are almost here, and FanDuel has given new customers an incredible way to get in on the action. Right now, when you join FanDuel and place your first $5 bet, you'll get $250 in bonus bets if your bet wins. I love how FanDuel makes betting so easy, whether it's picking my favorite team or diving into player props, which you know I'm doing this year. I've got the Celtics making it back to the NBA Finals, and I got them going back-to-back. I want to see a Celtics-Thunder matchup. You can go check out so many more player props, anything like that, teams, futures, all that over on FanDuel, from three-pointers to steals to assists. FanDuel has so many ways to bet your favorite player props. Plus, after the game tips off, you can even combine live prop bets into a same-game parlay for a chance to win big. Don't miss out. Head to FanDuel.com and claim your $250 in bonus bets today. Lars, there were a couple points in practice 7 on Tuesday that you and I and, our buddies Alex Katz and Nick Lemkow, we all kind of turned to each other and said, this hasn't been the most, eventful practice compared to some of the other ones we've been at. But it was really eventful for two guys in particular. One I know you're really excited to talk about in a few minutes here, Chris Lawson. But we have to start with Rashid Williams because he was the big star of the day.
Absolutely. I mean, and again, I think the thing worth noting in that is Rashid's a redshirt sophomore, I guess, but redshirt sophomore. So he's been the guy that's kind of been waiting in the wings, was going to, would follow in the Rome mold in that sense, just, being that next outside receiver. But Chris Lawson is a freshman. So you're talking about two different, levels here. And I think that's why Rashid's going to always be above Chris, just because he's that next guy in line. But it's worth, again, that's where you're talking about the healthy depth and rotation. But yeah, Rashid, man, when he had that I think it was his fourth or fifth, 11-on-11 catch where he had that pirouette. Again, some will say he pushed off, some will say he didn't. I didn't hear a referee or see a whistle, so, no blood, no foul. But it's still that athleticism, that ability to go up and get the ball. Again, if the referee doesn't see it in the game, we don't have the ability in college football right now to just challenge every single play and call a penalty in retrospect. Now, again, some are egregious, and that's a different discussion. But just his ability, his overall athleticism, that was a guy where how high on him I was last season.
Absolutely.
And I think so. It's not that I'm, again, not high still on Rashid at the same point, but I'm just kind of looking down the line. Okay, Rashid and who else? Denzel, Rashid, and who else? Then Rashid's already in the club. Okay, now we're looking at who else is going to join him in the club, and that would be Chris Hanson for me. But Rashid overall had the best day.
So I want to dive into a couple of things you said there. First of all, I think Omari Evans has quickly moved himself into that category where we haven't seen him on the field in a little while. He's dealing with a minor injury. We've seen him doing some running sort of on the side fields and working out with some of the guys who are working their way back from various minor injuries. So it doesn't seem like it's anything to be concerned about there. But in his stead, Rashid has certainly impressed, where the way I want to talk about it was one of the things I had written down in my notebook was there was a play early on, I believe it was in one of the 11 periods, where he went over, it was on the far side of the field away from us on the right side of the end zone. And he had a ball in both hands, and Caleb Presley did a good job punching it out for a pass breakup. It was a very physical play. Caleb did a good job making a play. But from that point on, it seemed like it kind of flipped a switch for Rashid Williams, where it's not even that he didn't have a drop. He was just really on fire from that point on, where the routes were really crisp. He was making physical plays where he's had, you talked about the physical catch where he kind of had the stiff arm and had to go over, just kind of reach back across his body to make a nice play. He had a couple other really long ones. There was one down the far sideline that was a nice 40-yard gain or so. And then he had another one where he ran a wheel route kind of up the near sideline in front of us, and he got touchdown at around the 2-yard line. That's where the ref marked him. And, in a game, it seems like his momentum would have carried him into the end zone there. So Jedd Fisch gave him the touchdown. So there were a whole lot of nice plays that he made over the course of the day, where I'm at this point where I'm just curious to see how this rotation is going to work out. Because as we get into Chris Lawson, another person that we need to mention in that same light is Kevin Green, who made a few nice plays today. And it's a debate of who you want starting in the slot more likely than not. Where it's one thing where when you and I talk about Omari Evans, it's, hey, he's a 1-year transfer who's going to come in and make an impact this season, but isn't going to preclude, taking snaps away from a Rashid Williams, from a Chris Lawson, Braden Vinesbright, whoever else it might be long term. And when I look at just what Rashid did today, it might not be his natural position, but do you start him in the slot anyway? And just say, you have that guy, or because I think that Omari would be best utilized outside with his straight line speed. but do you find a way to get Rashid on the field more? If I'm Jedd Fisch, I'm certainly thinking about it, but Chris Lawson, Kevin Green, a couple other guys have certainly made that tough, which is a good problem to have.
I think that's the key, is where it's okay. You're not looking for, who's our third receiver, where like, hey, so-and-so's got to step up. So-and-so's got to step up. It's just one of those guys will emerge as byproduct of
Yes.
Our water rises to the top. Somebody by proxy is going to pop in that room. But by the way, let's say 2 or 3 guys strike out or 1 or 2 get hurt or whatever, that's, you have the depth still to be, okay, well, hey, if you don't have Rashid, you got Kevin. You don't have Kevin, you got Rashid. If you have Audrey, there's enough guys there. But I think what you're kind of alluding to kind of speaks to, I think that problem gets solved not by who starts. Because again, starting is very kind of symbolic in a sense, where Puka Nacua got a couple of starts. I remember he started the BYU, but played 2 snaps.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's a lot of start versus who has the most snaps and targets. Those are the latter 2 stats that I really care about. I think what it's going to come down to is, where are you on the field? Because Kevin Green over the middle has a different game than Rashid Williams, either creating an opening for somebody else outside, taking something else underneath. They're 2 different types of players. So both are going to see the field, but it's just a matter of how do you use them. It's like, again, it's a little more extreme example, but a running back where we see Jordan Washington, Adam Muhammad, you're going to find a way to use both those guys in the same class. And now, again, sure, Rashid, some of these guys are a little bit different class. But the point being, it's just how do you take advantage of mismatches? Everything, like Ryan Walter says, you're looking for one-on-ones. Jedd Fisch, what do you think he's looking for? One-on-ones. The touchdown, I believe, on that wheel route was, again, that's what you're looking for, that option. Like, who you're going to take your guy on offense and bet that the guy on whoever, safety, linebacker, whoever it is on defense, you are going to win that match. That's what you're trying to look for. And so it's a good problem to have. And I think it'll probably be like, not game by game, but almost where are you on the field is going to be like, let's say you're inside, call it the 15 or the 10. I would bet on Rashid being in the slot. If you're between the 20s, my money's on Kevin Green. And that's not to say that Kevin Green couldn't execute in the red zone. But again, if you're talking about big trees, a taller player, or even, honestly, by the way, one guy that might get lost in this, and it's not necessarily a receiver, but Decker DeGraff, where we were talking about, towards the end of practice, where it's like maybe he splits out. And I think that's something to consider as well. And so it's not, you're looking at saying, like you mentioned it perfectly, Omari's your number 2. Denzel's your 1. They play 2 specific roles there. Everybody else in Jedd Fisch's favorite part of the field, which is the middle, over the middle, and everything else in between, that's where it gets creative. And that's how you're trying to find those mismatches to allow, by the way, one of Denzel or more to get open over the top.
I'm shocked you didn't say a single word about Chris Lawson. I was just kind of waiting for that the whole time. I'm just going to give you the floor back because I know you have a lot you wanted to say on that.
I was going to say, well, yeah, to kind of segue off the Rashid and all these guys coming, like, this is one thing I remember I looked over to you when he had a couple, because he had, I think, 4 or 5, again, maybe even 6 like solid catches over, I want to say, like a 20-minute period. And I looked over and I said, I know the Rome thing is crazy, but my point, what I say, it's a high-end ceiling, like long-term, you could reach that ceiling. But the point is, when you just look at him, he knows how to go find the ball. He made an adjustment on it, and because you pointed this out, it was a bad throw in comparison, but I think it was DeMond. I don't know if it was one of the freshmen, but I think it was DeMond. I could be wrong. But my point is, whoever the quarterback was, the ball wasn't where it was supposed to be, and Chris made an actual adjustment to go get it on the other shoulder. And so
it was DeMond, yeah.
Okay, I just didn't want to say, hey, DeMond made a bad throw, because we all know how people look at it. Oh my God, DeMond made a bad throw. I was like, again, we're all human here. But the point being that it was more the impressive ability to contort his body, and it's that football IQ that just, you can't necessarily coach, but it's also a byproduct of good coaching, where he's clearly a lot more complete receiver than I think some people might give him credit for. And obviously, when you look at the size, like, he's 6 foot, 6'1", maybe he's not the 6'2", 6'3", but I think he plays just like it, and I think that's why I've been so high on him.
So I certainly understand where it was. There are a bunch of things I want to unpack here. Where the first thing is, we talked about Rashid Williams having the play broken up early on, where Chris Lawson had one of those too, where it was a kind of a fade route back left corner of the end zone, and he dropped a touchdown where he had an opportunity to reel it in and just couldn't, which, it does happen sometimes. And it looked like a freshman mistake at the time, and he rebounded really nicely from that. And when I look at the role that he could play in this offense, I understand what you mean when you talk about the Rome Odunze comp. I can't go near there because, and it's something, I know we discussed this, one-on-one, but it's something where he's just such a rare athlete when I look at Chris Lawson, I see somebody who's a really refined football player, just kind of in the way that there's like Jalen McMillan would be a little bit closer, just in terms of what we saw from Jalen McMillan's high school tape compared to what we've seen from Chris Lawson, where I don't think he's the same level of athlete where Jalen was, a 4.3 sort of guy coming out of high school. Right. And it's something where when I look at what Chris Lawson can bring to this offense, he's already proven that he can be a really reliable guy with his hands. He just has a fundamental understanding of how to play the position. He understands leverage. He understands a lot of just different little things on just on the level that, you wouldn't expect a true freshman early enrollee to just pick up as quickly as he has. So that's a really exciting piece of this. And it's why, you and I have talked about one, maybe two of these receivers finding a way onto the field. The more I watch him, the more I feel like it is going to be him because of just all those little things. Because Jedd talked about that a week or two ago, the last time we got a chance to speak to him, where he said it's not the on-field stuff. It's not the route running. It's not this. It's the little things. It's understanding motions. It's lining up properly. It's picking up the playbook. It's different little things like that. And if he can prove that he can do those things consistently, it's going to work out really well for him moving forward. And I'm just curious to see what that's going to look like. But Lars, there are a whole lot of other things we need to get to from practice. Lars, what else stood out to you on the field on Tuesday?
So, we'll kind of tie two into one here. I think you don't want to make any definitive statements, but it seems pretty clear that CJ Christian is going to probably be one of the two starters. Like, I don't want to say it for sure, but it just seems like the way that, and I don't want to, because again, we haven't seen a ton of it's not like making picks and doing anything like that, but it just seems like you can kind of sense this veteran presence at that safety position where even when they're going through drills, CJ and Alex McLaughlin kind of, exchanging notes as they come through a rep. That's one thing I noticed where it's like, each guy's kind of helping coach the next one up. But I think it seems like a veteran on down thing where it's not to say that Ryland Dillard-Allen isn't going to get a chance, because I think when we got to talk to Taylor Mays after practice today, it was clear hey, Ryland's going to find his way on the field at some point. So I'm just curious, I know we kind of talked about it recently, but just the safety play where we didn't see, we were joking about this where there weren't really a ton of notes in the notebook today. Again, there's some things we'll get to. And again, because I did see John Mosley left tackle, so I do want to talk about that here in a little bit. But just, it's nothing really was like, oh, wow, we had 4 or 5 drives and it was a lot. There was also something I do want to talk about later on in the segment, which was slight tease. But with that being said, just, I look at that safety position and I think, man, new coach coming in, full-time Taylor Mays, hadn't really been a coach before, but he's had all that experience. How would that translate? I think experience begets experience, and that's what we're seeing.
Sure. So, first of all, I'm not even 100% sure what you're talking about with that tease. So, all the Everdeers need to make sure they stick around for whatever that could possibly be. But no, I like where you're going with that, because one of the things that CJ Christian talked about was learning both safety positions, where just the way that Ryan Walters likes to utilize his defense and flip coverages and do different things like that. It's important that he learns how to do multiple things, where he talked about Alex McLaughlin being, Taylor Mays talked about Alex McLaughlin being somebody who, learned just being in a position where he was around the ball a little bit more often and having to learn how to play that drop safety role. And for CJ Christian, he had to do it the other way around, which is very interesting because we've seen those guys line up way more often in those spots than, after talking to Taylor, what you might consider their natural positions. So that's one thing I'm really interested about. And you talk about Ryland Dillard-Allen, you got a chance to talk to him. All the Everydayers should go check out that interview, which is over on our YouTube page as well. Just where you've been on this train of he is going to play in every game. And I certainly agree with you whether it be in special teams, they're going to find a way to get this guy on the field. And it's just really interesting to see how this position group is going to play out, where you have Vincent Holmes, you have Paul Menke, you have Alex along with CJ and McAlistine. And so it really is a deep, talented group. And just the more I look at it, the more I say I feel like we're not going to necessarily see a whole bunch of time where there are 3 guys on the field, unless you want to consider Rashawn Clark a pseudo safety in that realm, since that's what he came in as. But just the way these guys are going to be utilized, they're going to be so important to this defense, because the thing that we're going to see this show up the most, and I believe especially with CJ Christian, it's going to be in run support, where he is that big physical guy that you really need down in the box at different points in time. Where when we had our buddy Jake Budd on a few weeks ago, he talked about how it is the responsibility of whatever inside linebacker is, playing back, because we've seen X-Ray Alexander walk down and be an outside linebacker at different points in time. Whoever is going to be that other guy that's a little bit closer to line of scrimmage in the box, which feels like it's going to be CJ Christian more so than anybody else, from not only what we've seen in this point in time, but just how these guys are utilized and how they play on tape. I'm curious to see what that role is going to look like for him. And I think he's going to be just such a critical piece in run support this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was also why, when we talked about this offseason, that's why you're going at 2, not one or the other. And I think it's also worth telling, again, we talked about it on the show, but it was no matter who was the safeties coach. I think it's clear it's either Matt Doherty or Jedd, one of the two, because I know Jedd spent some time with CJ Christian when he came in for his visit, when he met with John Richardson, and kind of John Richardson was the one that laid out the plan. So I think that was kind of telling as to who was going to, coach that position. Yeah. I don't know. I said it without saying it, but neither here nor there. Anyways, but you just look at it, I think it's checking every box where we saw last season, whether it be at safety or just any position where you need the bodies and multiple of them. You can't just say, hey, we got our Shaq or we got our Denzel or whatever. It's like, no, go and get more. You can't just rely on one, because in the Pac-12, let's be honest, you can probably get away with that. You can't in the Big Ten, and especially when you're hosting Ohio States and you're going to need some help and run support there. And so all those types of things factor into it. And I think also getting a guy, 2 veterans, and then you throw McKell in that same mix where it's a healthy veteran. Again, the Twin Towers, as they were known in Arizona, Takari on Infusion's price lock outside. Like, that's a lot of range and athleticism in the second.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I want to move on here because you hinted at it. You talked about John Mills playing left tackle. Let's start there before we get to whatever the surprise is that you have.
Yeah, and I think, because we've seen Mills mostly on the interior line, but in a way, kind of what Scott Huff used to do. We'll give you a couple of days outside. We're going to flip you at some positions just to give you some practice reps. And I remember, kind of you look at some guys back in the day of old staffs, and you think, wow, that was a wasted practice because they never ended up playing there. And then some guys, it's like, hey, no, we actually needed an emergency tackle. And I think it's worth, again, validating, all these freshman offensive linemen that came in, the size is there. So Mills was that's what was surprising. I wrote it down. I was like, okay, left guard 72. And I was like, wait, where's the tackle? There's nobody to the left of him. And I was like, oh, wow. Well, I guess there's my answer. He's the left tackle. And again, it was with the backups. It wasn't like a first team rep, but again, I still think it was an intriguing rep in the sense of, okay, inside or outside, John Mills might play.
So I think it will be inside in the short term, but it's very clear that that's the long-term plan for him, where I know that doesn't come as a surprise to anybody, but it is worth noting that you're giving him those reps so early on in the spring, right? Where I think about Jack Schaefer, just looks like a long-term right tackle, in my opinion. And you look at just the way this class shapes up, you can build an offensive line from it completely if you want to, where you've got 2 tackles in Mills and Schaefer, Champ Talialia, and Jake Flores can end up as your guards. And Jedd Fisch said Lauren Coleman-Brusa might end up playing some center. So you have a full offensive line from this class, which is a nice thing to see. But I look at John Mills, and it's a conversation that you and I had almost a year ago, to the date on this podcast, where John Mills is on an unofficial visit last spring. And you and I saw him standing across the field, and you can certainly pick that guy out of a crowd. And he was standing right next to Marcus Bryant, who obviously, the SMU transfer, ended up at Mizzou. And you and I just kind of said to each other, if we didn't know which one was which, just in terms of size alone, John would be the one where it's, oh yeah, that's the all-conference tackle, right? Yeah. Where that's just kind of the size he has. And just watching him move, he's a really promising athlete on tape. And just being that big and that physical, I know there are some people who have, been in the comments, I've seen it on Twitter of, oh man, it's too bad that Washington doesn't want to take another offensive lineman. Where, yeah, for sure, you might take some lumps early on with John Mills, with Chantilly if they end up being a significant part of the rotation. But those are things that are only going to help them down the line. And I say that because it is so clear that this is the long-term plan. It is those guys, because that has been Jedd Fisch's thing since he arrived at Arizona in 2021. So that's something that you kind of just have to roll with, and that the youth is going to get that playing time. And it might as well start now as part of a rotation behind, a couple of veterans in Garen Hatchett and Zach Henning.
Exactly, and I think you also kind of hit it in the sense of, like, I'm sure Jonas Avellana had some bad snaps or bad reps at Arizona's freshman year or sophomore year, but again, nobody's going to remember that. Where if it's half a dozen or a dozen, hey, he got beat there, hey, he got beat there. It's like, great, that's getting beat as a freshman, one thing, redshirt freshman, another thing. He's not having that as a sophomore and a junior. Like right. You get that improvement, and that's how you go from 5-7, 6-7 to 10-2. Like, hello, like that's how you make that jump, and which is actually a great springboard, half pun intended there, into the other point that I wanted to make about this with Jedd, where it's again the same thing with Arizona, where one thing I did take away from practice today, where the offense, both they didn't get a touchdown in that once 11-on-11 period, and I remember pointing out, it's like, so Jedd's still struggling in the red zone, and and I think it's just one of those and again, you could chalk it up to. And this was the other thing, by the way. Like, you could chalk it up to, maybe Ryan Walters had a good play. Maybe it just was what it was. Maybe the scheme design. But there was a couple intriguing routes. So I'm like, okay, like that's an intriguing red zone route here. And it's just like, you have all the horses, but it still comes down to making sure you actually call the right calls, and then those calls get executed. It's a pair operation there. And so it's one of those offseason takeaways where it's, well, how can a coach get better? How does the coach get better and better through his players? Again, you get better players is one thing. But if you can't, I'm not saying this. I'm not saying Jedd can't go. I'm just saying, like, now you have to make sure that those drives end in touchdowns. Where, worth noting, again, additionally, Grady Gross, I think he's fine. I think Grady will be fine. I think Grady will be fine this season. Yeah, he's good.
No, so I like where you're going with that. And let's end on this note. Where, it's because it's one thing where you certainly make a bunch of great points right there in terms of Jedd needs to continue to find ways to improve his play calling in the red zone, where having a set of scripted plays isn't always going to tell you everything, where it's not like, oh yeah, it's 2nd and 7. And no, it's 7-8 plays for anybody who hasn't been out to a practice. And it's always from the same spot on the field. And it's something I always say to you, there are 1 or 2 particular play calls that are always the exact same. So that is certainly a small part of this as well for anybody who might, just say, oh, might want to overreact to that. But I want to talk about it this way. And I want to bring up a point that you made a couple of times last season. And that's the play calling is certainly very different with Demond Williams at the helm. Now, here's how I'm going to tie this whole show together. He likes these mobile quarterbacks where you can run some read option in the red zone. You can do a whole lot of other different things, which is why, if Derek Zammit has become priority number 1, which certainly seems like he has, having somebody like that, a super mobile threat in the backfield, helps you immensely close to the goal line, because we saw it against Indiana, where when you spread guys out and you put your best athletes in space, you will find a way to make good things happen. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thanks to all everydayers tuning in. We really do appreciate your support. We got so much more fun stuff coming for you throughout spring practice, throughout the offseason. So please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating this channel with new content every single day. So make sure you click that like button, click that little bell so you never miss when we post a new video. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please, if it's 5-star reviews, it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Thursday.